Buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a esta nueva conferencia del Cybersecurity Conference de CISAP para el 2022. Hoy en la tarde tenemos un panel de lujo. Vamos a estar charlando de Zero Trust y el memorándum que la Casa Blanca le mandó en mayo del año pasado a todas las agencias federales. Una de las cosas que a veces no le ponemos mucha atención es que el Internet se ha vuelto tan peligroso porque nosotros, los usuarios del Internet, confiamos demasiado y ponemos demasiada información sin las protecciones adecuadas, sin la validación adecuada de con quién estamos interactuando. Y por supuesto, los adversarios encontrarán formas de atacar, formas de penetrar y formas de utilizar esta información para diferentes usos. Típicamente, el uso más difundido es la monetización de nuestros datos o de la escasez de nuestros datos. Como les decía, hoy tenemos un panel de lujo y va a estar moderado por Irwin Samos, que es nuestro gerente de arquitectura, con un montón de experiencia en campo y teórica. Junto con Irwin tenemos a Sherry Ramsey, con quien hemos colaborado en el pasado y nos da un gran honor y una gran satisfacción de que esté aquí con nosotros. Está Doel Santos de Palo Alto, está Carlos Pérez de Netscope y está Luis Faro de ForcePoint. Todas estas organizaciones, Palo Alto, Netscope y ForcePoint, están activamente implementando la arquitectura de Zero Trust para clientes y van a tener bastantes comentarios muy importantes que aportar a la plática. Sin más, vamos a seguir adelante. Les agradezco muchísimo que estemos juntos nuevamente y estaremos comenzando en pocos segundos. Muchas gracias.
SAP, Sistemas Aplicativos. Durante este tiempo, hemos incursionado en muchas áreas de la tecnología de la información, liderando el mercado a través de la innovación, calidad y servicio al cliente, ofreciendo los siguientes servicios. Arquitectura, RIF-DR, equipo de respuesta a incidentes forenses Data Recovery, Ingeniería y soporte, PMO, SOC, consultoría, outsourcing, capacitaciones y Customer Success. Realizamos operaciones en distintos países como Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panamá y República Dominicana. Además, nuestros clientes están situados en Estados Unidos, México, Centroamérica, Colombia, Ecuador, Perú, Chile, Brasil y otros países. Nuestro SOC en Guatemala se sitúa en el edificio Forum Zona Viva. Además, contamos con un segundo SOC en la ciudad de Panamá. Actualmente CISAP está certificado como CERT por parte de la Universidad de Carnegie Mellon, que a través de su software, Engineering Institute, nos ha dado entrada a su red de certs. Nuestro personal cuenta con más de 70 certificaciones de SIEM, Malware Reverse Engineering, Penetration Testing, Forensics, Incident Response, entre otras. CISAP, con más de 150 ingenieros trabajando para sus socios comerciales, con más de 1000 certificaciones, alianzas estratégicas con Nova Coast, IBM, Verizon, contribuidor de Verizon, en donde CISAP contribuye generando reportes e información local recolectada, alimentando el reporte de este año, poniendo en el mapa la región de Centroamérica y el Caribe, que no habían tenido datos significativos anteriormente. También estamos certificados por FIRST, que es una confederación internacional de equipos confiables de respuesta a incidentes informáticos, que manejan cooperativamente incidentes de seguridad informática y promueven programas de prevención de incidentes. CISAP, Sistemas Aplicativos.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in another session of this series of cybersecurity conferences. For those of you who need translation, there is a button at the bottom of the Zoom window, so you can choose which language you prefer. Like Mauricio said, today we are going to talk about the Zero Trust Memorandum issued by the White House to the federal government agencies. Maybe some of you are familiar with the executive order that was issued on May last year. And this was about improving national cybersecurity posture for the United States. Then a follow-up document, a memorandum in January of this year, was about this transition to a zero trust architecture. For those of you who attended on the third session that we had of this series of conferences, we already addressed 5 steps to implement a zero trust architecture. And today we are going to address 4 points that are very important. The first one is, what is a zero trust architecture? The second is why this model was adopted by the United States to improve the cybersecurity posture of the whole nation. The third one is, what are some examples of cyber attacks that could have been prevented or contained using zero trust? How this architecture will work in a real-world scenario. And to give answers to these questions, let's introduce our panel of experts. Sherry, Doel, Carlos, and Luis, thank you so much for being here with us today. So for the audience to get to know you better, could you tell us a little bit about yourselves? Let's start with Sherry Ramsey.
Sure, thank you, Erwin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sherry Ramsey. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics from the University of Georgia and a master's degree in computer science from the Johns Hopkins University. I also have a master's degree in national resource strategy from the National Defense University and a certificate in leadership from the University of Virginia. I worked at the National Security Agency here in the US for 34 years. There, I really had a front seat as this thing that we're now calling cyber was born. I led organizations in signals intelligence, information assurance, technology, and research. In my last position, I was the director of NSA's Threat Operations Center, where I built and operated a 24/7 cyber operations center focused on monitoring, detecting, countering, and mitigating cyber threats. Since retiring from the National Security Agency, I'm passionate about this thing that we call cyber or cybersecurity. So I've continued to work as a cybersecurity consultant, working in strategy development and planning, coaching, performing cybersecurity assessments, and supporting the development of security operations centers.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and thank you for being here with us. Let's continue with Doel Santos.
Absolutely. Super happy to be here. My name is Doel Santos. I'm originally from Puerto Rico. I got my bachelor's degree in information systems in Puerto Rico as well. I've been working with Palo Alto Networks in the last 5 years, mostly in the Unit 42 team. Unit 42 is the threat intel team and incident response team from Palo Alto Networks. My subject matter expertise is threats. That's what I do. I'm a senior threat researcher. I look at different types of threats every day, mostly ransomware and cybercrime operations. I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with the adversary playbooks that has been developed by Unit 42, but I was one of the main contributors to that initiative, where organizations from public and private sector could ingest taxi feed and stick objects into their system so they can know and understand threats with more context. Thank you very much.
So much.
Super excited.
Thank you so much for being here as well. Let's continue with Carlos Perez.
Hi, my name is Carlos Perez. I'm graduated from La Salle University in Mexico. I was graduated with honors. I studied the career of cybernetics and computer systems. I have more than 25 years experience in the technology industry in Mexico, Latin America. The 10 most recent year of professional experience have been in the field of cybersecurity. I have had the privilege to work for companies such as Cisco Systems, Hewlett Packard, Palo Alto Networks, Google, and now Netscope. And during the 8 years I worked for Palo Alto Networks, I had the privilege to lead the pre-sales engineering team for Latin America. Super happy to be here and share a little bit of all these zero trust concepts with all the participants of this webinar.
Thank you, Carlos. We're happy to have you here as well. Let's continue with Luis Faro. I'm sorry, we can't hear you, Luis. Maybe you're on mute. Not yet. Not yet. Maybe you could try to change your microphone. Not yet, but I have your bio here. In the meantime, I could read it if you want. Okay, Luis Faro, Engineer Director for Latin America at ForcePoint, CISSP certified, systems engineer with over 15 years of experience in important manufacturers such as ForcePoint, Symantec, and RSA. Currently, the leading director of the engineering team for ForcePoint in Latin America, holds a bachelor degree in electrical engineering by the University of Sao Paulo, and an MBA in Fundación Getulio Vargas, has joined extension courses in renowned institutions such as MIT and Carnegie Mellon. Thank you for being here with us today, Luis. So let's begin with the topic that brought us all here. And we are going to do this activity through questions and answers. So the first question is for Sherry Ramsey. Can we begin having a unique definition about what a zero trust architecture is and how is it different from the traditional ones we know?
Yeah, absolutely, Erwin. Before we define zero trust, though, and what it is, let's take just a couple of seconds and talk about why we need this framework that we're calling zero trust. So let's set the stage. Adversaries are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their methods and operations. They're attacking our networks, they're going after our supply chains, they're trying to access our critical infrastructure, and they want to steal all kinds of sensitive information. And that's not just information from our governments, but information from our industry as well. Products that we buy, unfortunately, just about every product that we buy is going to have vulnerabilities, all of these products. And so we have to try to figure out what to do with that. Our IT providers, whether we outsource them or whether they're in our own company or government, are often hesitant to, or they're either unable to voluntarily share information on cyber incidents. And as you probably all know, our threat environment is continuously changing. Who's attacking us, what they're attacking, the tools and procedures they use. The bad guys are sharing all of these things, and so they have really become ubiquitous. And so this is the environment that we're in today. In the past, what we focused on perimeter defense, what I'm going to call perimeter defense. This required us to know the edges of our networks, that is, all the places where our networks touch or interface with other networks. Then once we've identified those edges, if you will, of our network or the perimeter of our network, then we need to try to minimize the number of those touch points, because we need to monitor every one of those touch points or edges. And then as we're monitoring, we have to try to identify and block any malicious activity. And unfortunately, we have to try to do that at speed, which is very, very difficult. But this approach is really not working. So malicious activities are continuing to get through the perimeter, And actually, there are more and more malicious activities that are inside of our networks because the threats don't always come from the outside. So given this threat environment, given the difficulties of detecting and taking action at the perimeter at speed, we've really needed a new approach. And the approach that we are going to talk about today is one of those approaches, which I think is leading the way, and that is called Zero Trust. So what is Zero Trust? It's really a paradigm shift in philosophy of how we secure our networks, our infrastructure, and our data. It's a shift from verify once at the perimeter to continual verification of each user, each device, each application, and each transaction. This is really a fundamental change that we're talking about here. It means that no person, no system, no network, no application, or no service that operates either inside or outside the perimeter of our networks can be trusted. We must verify everyone and everything attempting to establish any access to anything within our networks. So we can define Zero Trust as an approach that secures an organization by eliminating any implicit trust and then continuously validating every single step, every stage of any digital operation. So that's kind of a fancy definition, if you will. But what it does is Zero Trust requires all users, whether you're inside or outside an organization or a network, to be authorized, authenticated, and continuously validated before being granted access to any application and or any data. And then it also requires the same thing of any device trying to access, any application trying to access, or any service that's being performed. And any of these users, these devices, these applications, these services, even when they're authorized access, they're given very specific access to only specified applications and data. So that's a lot of words, but let's just kind of review at the end some key points to remember. The first one is that in Zero Trust, we have to verify explicitly. There is no implicit trust, only explicit verification. The second point is we always have to authenticate and authorize based on all available data points. And we use user identity, location, device health, data class, etc., any kind of information that's available. The third point to remember, and this one is key, is that any user, any application, any device, any service, they are all continuously validated and only granted access to specific authorized devices, applications, and data. And the fourth point is that our governance policy must always be as least privileged access. So we don't just open up our networks, our data, and give anybody access to everything. It's only least privileged access. And I will throw in, all of this sounds really great, but there is a disadvantage, that we're continuing to work on, and that is speed. Obviously the time that it takes to verify, validate, authenticate, and authorize any user, any application, any device, any data, any service takes time. And so the disadvantage is speed. But I do think that we are working on that such that we can accomplish all of this, make our networks more secure, and do it within a satisfactory timeframe.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and thorough explanation, Sherry. And it is really interesting that before we were told that we could trust what was inside the perimeter, but now we are being told that the perimeter is going to disappear and we shouldn't trust anything or anyone. So I don't know, Carlos, if you would like to add something on top of that explanation.
Well, Sherry elaborated very clearly a very comprehensive explanation of Zero Trust. I will just add that this is a security model right now for companies that are evaluating how to implement this security model. they will find a lot of information regarding the Zero Trust security model. So basically, my point is, this is basically a security approach. It's not a specific product or a certification. Something important and very interesting is the memorandum that you mentioned, Irwin, is based in the CISA, in the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Zero Trust model. And basically, the structure that the CISA defines in the Zero Trust model mentions several key pillars, which are identity, devices, networks, applications and workloads, and finally data. So this is very comprehensive, and it's important that companies and organizations have a plan in order to deploy and to make a strategy in order to adopt this security model.
Okay, great. So now that we are on the same page with this concept of zero trust model or architecture, even though it goes back to 2010, let's read about this memorandum, and it communicates at the very beginning. It says, the United States faces persistent and increasingly sophisticated malicious cyber campaigns that threaten the public sector, the private sector, and ultimately the American people's security and privacy. So with this in mind, I would like to ask Doel, given your experience in threat intelligence, what kind of cyber attacks are we seeing in these states?
Sure. I mostly see it in two different groups, right? So we basically have the groups that are going to be financially motivated, right? So those are groups that are going to be opportunistic, very ubiquitous, as I said before. They're going to be all around the place. And their main goal is just to make money, right? Under this type of threat, under this type of group, right, we'll see stuff like BECs, which is business email compromise attacks, which are going to be the famous scams that you see on the mail, trying to trick you to do a wire transfer from your account. Info stealers trying to steal your information to be sold on the dark web, on underground forums. Uh, the boogeyman now, ransomware, is one of the top highest grossing cybercrime incidents that we've seen in the year. It has impacted both public sector, private sector organizations in the last 4 years. But these are not the only type of threats that we observe, right? There are another group which focus more into the more of a traditional cyber espionage type of things, right? Which is currently attributed to nation state threat actors. And these groups are, their objectives vary, right? Depending on the country they are targeting. So you'll see attacks such as trying to destabilize a country, try to do traditional espionage on systems, trying to sit down and watch and try to be undetected for as long as possible. But just to bring out a recent example, the Russia and Ukraine conflict that happened earlier this year and still happening. But in the beginning of the year, we started seeing a lot of Russia type cyber type attacks against Ukraine, trying to destabilize the nation, right? Developing wipers and stuff like that, and even trying to impact the United States as a proxy in response to that, right? So it really varies in the terms of the United States and the landscape of the United States threat actors impacting. The most recent example I can think of right now is SolarWinds, right? I'm not sure if you are familiar with SolarWinds, but SolarWinds was a big attack back in 2020. It was in December 13. I remember this very well. If you're an incident responders or threat intel, this should be like a holiday because a lot of people were working on this stuff. But pretty much the breach and the scale of this attack, right? It was a supply chain attack backed up by the Russian government. Or at least it's been attributed to the Russian government against the United States that is responsible for a lot of data breaches that happened on that particular year. So just to recap, right, we have the two type of threats or two different groups that I like to mention: financially motivated threats and nation-state sponsored traditional espionage threats. That covers the whole landscape that we're seeing in the United States. That not only impacts organizations in the private and public sector, but also impacts individuals all around the world.
Okay, thank you so much for that excellent explanation. And it is fascinating that the same vectors of cyber attacks, techniques, that the attackers are using for a whole nation, to attack a whole nation, are the same techniques and vectors, and like you said, financial motivated, to attack some organizations around the world. So we can learn a lot from that. And it is noteworthy as well that this mandate was issued only 5 days after the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. So continuing with you, Joel, could you tell us what we know so far about what happened and how it happened?
Sure. So the Colonial Pipeline incident is also another holiday that should be on every good intel research person in the industry. Pretty much what happened is there's a ransomware group or ransomware as a service called DarkSide, which pretty much impacted Colonial Pipeline, stealing, I think it was 100 gigabytes of data out of their system. 100 gigabytes of data sounds pretty small, but it's not really about the aspect that they stole the data. It's the aspect that they got in and disabled pretty much the full pipeline on the East Coast in the United States for a couple of days, right? So the research, I wasn't really part of the investigation on the Colonial Pipeline incident. I wish, but pretty much it's been noted that the threat actors got into the system through a compromised account. So this compromised account was leaked on the dark web. The threat actors bought it or found it, and they got in through that account, which is using a legacy VPN, right? And the legacy VPN didn't have any kind of multi-factor authentication. So that meant that once the threat actor got in, there was really no way of the individual of knowing that their account was really compromised. So I think that on May 6th was when the intrusion happened, right? They got into the system, they did a data theft, and then on May 7th is where the Colonial Pipeline notices they're being breached. You know, they use this type of ransomware groups. They like to brag about their compromises. So as soon as they became aware, this post came onto the dark side leak site saying, "Hey, we compromised Colonial Pipeline," which is quite dangerous for a ransomware group to do, right? Because it will bring attention of law enforcement real fast. You know, a lot of people start moving around trying to disable this group. Um, the pipeline, you know, went offline on May 7th, trying to recover, and eventually they paid out the ransom that I think was around $5 million. Which then made Joe Biden declare an emergency declaration against this incident on May 9, and I think on May 12 they were able to restore the pipeline, which is shortly where the memorandum pretty much came out. Um, I think the congressional hearing was on June 8, and it was discovered in the hearing that the Department of Justice was able to recover at least half of the amount paid from the ransomware from the threat actors. So they were able to recover $2.3 million from the 4.4 or $5 million that were paid at that particular moment.
Yeah, it's this of a special interest that we can find a lot of information. We can read a lot of information on the internet about this financial impact, but all it took was one compromised password. And it takes me to think about the concepts of zero trust. VPN is disappearing, and it says always verify. And even though we have a valid username and a valid password, we must verify the identity of that user. So I would like to ask Carlos, could you please elaborate why a zero trust architecture could have been effective to counter this kind of cyber attacks?
Of course. Well, one of the key core principles of zero trust model is to grant the least amount of privilege to a user. So basically what we want to ensure is that the information is accessed by the right user at the right time and for the right purposes. Given the fact that in this attack, one identity was compromised, the idea of having several additional factors, such as multi-factor authentication, could be an additional layer of protection. In addition, in the memorandum and also in the zero trust model defined by CISA, the recommendation is to validate the identity of the user in the application and not in the network. Why is that? Because if we allow a user to get access via one identity to a complete network, basically we are opening the door to this user to all the resources that are basically reachable from that VPN in this case. So several things could be avoided by this approach, by the zero trust. For example, another type of prevention could be to validate the identity of the device, to check if the device is known to the organization, make a posture validation to see if that device is really a device from the company that is being affected. And last but not least, having a micro-segmentation strategy. And the idea behind the micro-segmentation is to have an isolated environment where all the different segments within the network are completely separate in order to avoid any lateral movement from the adversary and prevent that adversary to gain additional access to certain parts of the network where basically the important data is located. So in summary, yes, definitely a zero trust architecture could prevent not only this incident, but it could enhance and it can improve the security posture of many organizations and companies across the world.
Okay, thank you so much. So this question is for Luis, but we're going to give some context before. So far, we have been talking about how effective a zero trust architecture is. However, this is not a silver bullet. This is not like I'm going to implement zero trust architecture and everything is going to be fine. I'm not going to be cyber attack anymore. It's not like that. Still, we need to do some basic things like knowing exactly what is in our network or having an asset inventory or an enterprise inventory of the assets. So, Luis, why is it important to do the basic things before even thinking about a more sophisticated architecture like Zero Trust?
It's usually the basic. You can hear me now, right?
Yes, we can hear you okay.
Oh, nice. It's important to keep the basics in mind because they manage your attack surface. And those basic configurations, they're key for you to understand where are your crown jewels. We have to understand that it's very easy to implement projects that have infinite budget, but those are not real. We have limited time, we have limited resources, and we only can do so much for our assets. So it's key to understand which assets contain the most valuable information, which assets are most important for our internal processes to run, so we can deliver a better protection, and we can put those in front of the line of our zero trust implementation. It's a journey, it's not a destination. We are not becoming zero trust from 1 minute to the other. It's about migrating to this architecture bit by bit, and the key assets and the key processes in our organization need to be prioritized. And for this, the basic must be done, meaning that you have to have an information inventory, you have to have your critical processes mapped, you have to have your vulnerabilities under control, or at least known, so you understand what you have to protect first. That's basic, but as a CISO that is a good friend of mine said, most of the time it's about doing the basics with excellence, and that's all.
Okay, that's a great advice. Sherry, on this regard of knowing exactly what is in our networks, I know you have a great experience to share with us.
I was actually doing some consulting work with a client who will remain nameless. And one of the things, and this goes back to the comment that was just made about doing the basics, excellent. And so I was suggesting to them that they needed to make sure that they had an inventory of all of their software and hardware. That is, that they knew exactly what they had, exactly what was running in their system, where it was located, what was connected to what. And they laughed and they said, of course we know that. And so I asked them to show me the inventory. And of course they did not have an inventory. They didn't actually have it written down. But I said, well, let's make one. So they very reluctantly began walking around with me to all of the hardware in their facility, and actually writing on a sheet of paper, this is the piece of hardware, this is the serial number, and kind of writing down everything that we knew about it and when it was connected, where it was connected, what it was connected to. So we opened this was a pretty large facility. So I said, what is in that room over there? So nobody knew. So we opened the door and went in the room, and there were a couple of pieces of hardware in there. I think one was a router, one was a server, and everybody kind of looked at each other, and nobody knew where this hardware came from. Nobody knew who purchased it. Nobody knew when it was purchased. Nobody knew when it was in the system. And of course, nobody knew what it was doing. So we actually sent a note out to everyone in the company and the organization and asked if anybody knew anything about these two pieces of hardware. And after a week, we had gotten not a response from anyone. So the hardware was clearly plugged in, it was clearly, I don't know what it was doing, but it seemed to be doing something. So I suggested to them, well, if we wanted to know how quickly it was doing something important, then let's just unplug it and see who came knocking at our door. So they did not think that was a great idea, but they eventually decided to do that. So we actually unplugged the two pieces of hardware, and guess what? No one ever came knocking at our door. No one ever complained, that something had stopped working. So, kind of the bottom line is I won't say that there was anything nefarious that was going on. We weren't able to prove that. But there were two pieces of hardware connected into their network, plugged in and running, and no one knew it was there. So, again, kind of back to the basics. It's just really important that we practice, the basic hygiene as we're on our way to implementing Zero Trust. And that means understanding not only what's in your network, but understanding who and what are trying to access various pieces within your network.
I'm sure that never happens in Latin American organizations. Yeah, right. So, Luis, continuing with you, what type of cyber attacks have you seen contained or even avoided in real-life Zero Trust networks?
Yeah, Irvin, I love this question because this question is really on the traditional mindset, which is I have to know what is attacking me. When we talk about Zero Trust, we can implement something really different, that is prevention without detection, and that's not usual. That's a little uncomfortable for us, that we've been detecting for so long, and we know that we have a WannaCry, a Petya, or whatever the malware of the day is. But with Zero Trust, what we understand is what is good, how our network is supposed to behave, how our devices are supposed to behave, and we stop wherever is outside this scope. So to this end, we actually are able to prevent attacks without actually knowing what the attack is. We just know it's not the normal behavior of my stuff. It's not my usual data flow. It's not my usual users, not my usual devices. It's not my usual infrastructure. So we can, in theory, call several attacks. I said WannaCry, I said Petya, and I can name a lot of others and a lot of newer ones. But in the end of the day, I can virtually stop any attack because I will stop deviations on my infrastructure without even knowing what I'm stopping. And I will not name them. So it doesn't matter what is attacking me. What matters is that's not the good known. And if it's not the good known, I'm not trusting, and I'm stopping it. And I'm stopping a behavior, not a code, not a malware. it might be a person. It might be a person that today decided to attack me. Whatever it is, we are stopping and we don't care about naming it. And that's the zero trust world.
Great, thank you. So as we mentioned at the beginning of this session, this order was issued on May 2021. So several months have passed so far. And I would like to ask Sherry, would you say that major changes have been made already in the government agencies so far to become more cyber resilient?
Yes. So as Erwin mentioned, in May of 2021, Executive Order 14028 was issued. And that really was to initiate an entire government-wide effort to ensure that baseline security practices were in place, to migrate the federal government to a zero trust architecture to hopefully make our networks and data more secure, and then to realize the security benefits of cloud-based infrastructure while mitigating the associated risk of cloud-based infrastructure. And then, months go by as everything moves kind of slow within the US federal government, and the memorandum came out in January 2022, specifically on zero trust strategy. And what that memorandum did was it directed agencies to develop a transition plan, an implementation plan to go to zero trust architecture. And they had to do that within 60 days. So every agency has now identified a zero trust implementation lead and has put in place this transition plan, which includes budget and everything else to begin to transition to a zero trust architecture. The whole idea also was, now that we've named these leads, that the leads are beginning to work together. So CISA, within the Department of Homeland Security, has created a zero trust maturity model in which they name 5 pillars of a zero trust maturity model, which is identity, devices, networks, applications and workloads, and data. They also came out with and specified 3 themes that have to go along as you're implementing this zero trust architecture. And that is visibility. Of course, if we're going to do all this verification and validation and authentication, we have to have visibility into our networks. So visibility and analytics. And then, because this is quite a bit of work, and we talked about speed, it also one of the themes is automation and orchestration. How do we do this? And then the last, and I even called out this on one of the points that we needed to remember, is governance. Our CISA then also worked with industry to co-author a cloud security reference architecture to be used in conjunction with our zero trust reference model. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has also published a zero trust architecture framework that can be used by the government agencies. The NIST, National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, is collaborating with industry to create a document called Implementing a Zero Trust Architecture. So hopefully this will be a guideline for many of the agencies to use in implementing their zero trust architecture. And the idea is to really have this be a government and industry collaboration. We have collaborated at times before on different initiatives, but we can do much, much better. And so the whole idea is to bring the best that industry has to offer, like my counterparts that are here today, their companies, other companies, and to try to have the federal government be able to take advantage of that. The General Services Administration, or our GSA, they are the ones that have a list of products that we can buy. They negotiate prices for the entire federal government. They have developed a zero trust reference architecture buyer's guide. And also the agencies were given a task matrix, which had 19 tasks with due dates for each one of the agencies. Now, they've not published, I have the task list and it's available, but they The status of each one of these tasks by agency has not been published, but I believe that the White House is pretty serious about this, and so I think that they will be kind of called to meet, or at least to try to meet and show progress toward implementing these tasks. So that is kind of the progress that we've made. The Department of Defense has also developed a zero trust reference architecture. So at this point, I would say that we are collaborating among the government and then between government and commercial industry much better than we have before. And we have definitely created a plan for ourselves with due dates and milestones so that we can see and grade ourselves as we make progress and hopefully begin to make the federal government's networks and data more secure.
Okay, that's great to hear, and certainly it's a good example to follow in our own cybersecurity strategies as well. This question is for Joel. Have you seen any major changes in how the private sector and now public sector are working together, maybe sharing more information?
Yes, absolutely. I 100% agree with everything that Sherry said. I think that the main thing between public sector organizations and private sector is going to be communication. Establishing communication channels between the two is going to be the key aspect that has personally worked for us in Palo Alto Networks and the government as a whole. Not only we need to do and establish those channels for communication, there needs to be an exchange of information as well in terms of the different type of threats that they're facing. Sometimes we observe things that the government haven't observed yet. Sometimes the government observes things that we haven't observed yet. Usually, it's not very straightforward. Of course, there's a lot of complications behind it around the data, the sensitivity, and all that kind of stuff, right? Which is usually a choke point for both parties. But at least having the communication and the information sharing platform established, it could go long ways for us to be more proactive in terms of trying to tackle these threat actors where they're doing their operations, because this industry, sadly, is a very reactive industry, where somebody gets impacted, and then we all take a look at it, and then it's like, okay, what happened? Okay, how can we prevent this from happening again? And then we just create signatures, the rules, monitoring for that kind of threat all the time. So having that communication between government and private sector, and public sector and private sector, we can say, hey, nobody's been impacted yet, but we have been seeing this stuff being submitted, or we've seen this weird traffic going on around here, and everybody can just do their part, right, into tackling the major aspect of it. In Unit 42, I mean, and me personally, I've worked with the FBI to definitely identify threat actors or doing different type of operations. And when this type of incident happens, the FBI gets involved. We sit down, say, hey, this is the only information we have. Have you seen any kind of incidents, besides our incident? And that information exchange happens, and then everybody benefits from that particular thing. And obviously, I'm being like very U.S. based, but you can create these channels with every agency in the world, government in the world that has this process establishes and are really willing to help, right? Because in the end, we want the same thing. We want to make the world a better and a safer place, and making them more resilient. It's one step closer to achieve that.
So cooperation and information sharing, and we know for a fact that bad actors are always exchanging information. So why don't we? So all this considered,
Exactly.
many organizations have been forced by circumstances to start this journey, like you guys mentioned before, of digital transformation. So this could be a great opportunity maybe to start with some basic points about zero trust architecture. And this question is for Carlos. What things should be considered before going zero trust?
Of course, Irwin, thank you. Well, definitely, I think that one of the key aspects is to develop a clear plan. Organizations need to invest time and obviously do the research or the proper research in order to define a clear strategy to cross that that way and to follow the path to the zero trust. There's a lot of new technologies that help us to defend better against the advanced adversaries. For example, if adversaries are using automation to attack us, why we don't use automation also to defend ourselves and our organizations? There's new things, for example, for companies that are also in the journey of the digital transformation. Things such as, for example, new innovation and concepts, such as, for example, immutable workloads, to mention something that could help organizations to provide a consistent way to deploy workloads into the public cloud environments. Understand all the shared responsibility models. If an organization is deploying applications over public cloud providers, all these different aspects are relevant in order to build a solid strategy in order to achieve this goal of and a path and a journey to have a zero trust architecture. One final comment is to read and document a lot. The research is key. There's many documents that have been referenced during this conversation, such as all the documents that Sherry mentioned, such as the CISA Zero Trust Model. There's some great NIST guidelines and documents, such as, for example, the guidelines on minimum standards for developer verification of software. Just to mention some of the resources that are available and publicly accessible in order to individuals, companies, and organizations to develop a clear strategy in order to achieve this goal of the zero trust security framework.
Thank you so much for that explanation. So it's time to go with the questions of the audience. So we have 2 questions so far. And the first one is, what happens with single sign-on? Is it still recommendable to keep using it or not anymore?
So I don't think that that's a smart thing to do. I know in the executive order, and a lot of study went into this, it actually directs that the US federal government, every agency, implement multi-factor authentication. And so I think that that's really, especially in the vein of zero trust, where we talk about verify and authenticate and validate and, all of that, I think that multi-factor authentication is a significant part of that. And so I would recommend that everyone look toward doing something more than just a single sign-on.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. The other question we have is, with a little bit of context, historically, VPNs have been used for network access by officials. Even tools such as network access control have been incorporated. The question is, does the network access control, or NAC, still feel a good component of access enforcement? Or Zero Trust Network replaces or complements network access control?
So VPN and network access control, those are solutions that will still be in place for a while. As many of us said, zero trust is about an architecture. You can have VPN, you can have NAC, and still compensate your controls and get a zero trust architecture. Or you can replace for something else and get a zero trust architecture. And you can have both. You can have part of your environment that is legacy architecture and part of your environment that runs on zero trust. So it's about what you have, what you're willing to invest, how much change can you embrace, and what are the controls you're putting in place in order to check every step of the way. Zero trust is about having as many controls to detect the changes and the weird behavior as fast as possible and react to it as fast as possible. Uh, you can do it with solutions that have been in place for a long time, or you can adopt new stuff. It's it's about sitting down and creating an architecture that makes sense. Of course, there are new solutions that might make it easier, but you're not throwing your whole security investment for the past 10 years away just to new shiny things. It's it's about mixing and it's about the journey.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer. So we reached the conclusion of this seminar. So do you have any important conclusion points or key points to mention to the audience before we say goodbye? And if you want, we can follow the same order as before. Sherry, Doel, Carlos, and Luis.
Okay, so I always not very smart here, so I always try to limit my thoughts to three things. I figured that three things certainly I can handle, and I know you guys are a lot smarter than me, but I will still just kind of reiterate three things that I would like for you to walk away with, 3 points that we made during the talk. First is that it's important to make your networks as secure as possible. And this goes back to the comment about, making the best, making a basic, be excellent. And so it's kind of basic hygiene. I still strongly recommend the Center for Internet Security Controls, which is the Center for Internet Security put together an international coalition that has continued to put this framework in place. The last revision came out in May, and it has actually taken things like zero trust and cloud into consideration. So it's absolutely important to make your network as secure as possible just with basic hygiene. So that's point number one. Point number two is, and I go back to the comments that were just made, is then when you think about moving to implementing zero trust, it's not something that's going to be done overnight. I think it's going to require some thought. It's obviously going to require a little bit of budget. And so I think, you need a transition plan that will, transition over time your network to be more in compliance with this zero trust architecture. There's a lot of information out there that can help you. Even as I mentioned, the matrix, the task matrix, is actually publicly available online, and you can look at that. I'm sure it's not a one size fits all, but it might give you some ideas as to what you might want to consider as you write your implementation plan. And then last but not least, and we've hit upon this a couple of times, and that is we really all have to work together. There are no more perimeters. There are no more edges of any of our networks. It really is all just one big network. And we really do need to work together to protect our data, to protect ourselves. And when I say work together, I mean within government, between government and industry, also with academia, because we haven't talked about that today, but they have a huge role to play in what they educate and how they educate the next generation of cybersecurity practitioners. And not just within a single country, but also across countries, because it really is going to take everyone working together.
Thank you, Sherry. Now let's go with Doel.
Yeah, I would say that, try to recap here. He has a threat intel, threat related guy. Always be informed of different type of threats, right, as they occur, as it happen. Usually when I talk to people and customers are, well, what would it matter if they hack me, or if I'm part of a breach? It matters. It matters a lot. So always, because that information that you are giving out is very valuable to them. They can do whatever they want. It could be impacting you, not now, maybe, but in the future, who knows? Threat actors will exploit that information in one way or another. So always be informed of the latest threats in all kinds of aspects. Maybe you are not in a corporate or business environment. maybe you have a sandwich shop, right? But you use WhatsApp or you use whatever tools for communication to interact with your customer base, and that's something that that's something that the threat actors know, and something that could be exploited at any time. So having to identify the right approach for your organization, in the architecture for strategy to defend yourself against this type of threats is really something that you need to keep in mind and look at very, very, very thoroughly, right? Because the impacts that could have are quite significant.
Certainly, very good advice. Let's continue with Carlos.
Thank you. Yes. Well, a final comment on my side, it will be to, again, have a plan. I think that it's key in order to success. Do all the proper investigation previously. Document yourself, because this zero trust concept covers many, many disciplines and areas such as identity and all the different areas that we have covered during this talk. So it is good to be very well informed. And last but not least, we have talked about many different topics. However, the education of the user is also a key critical part of a zero trust strategy, because at the end, adversaries will try to pursue the end user, or to get the compromise of an end user in order to get access to a specific resource. So if we have good practices or best practices about teaching the end users how to prevent also on the human side to fall in the different deception techniques that the adversaries uses in terms of phishing and things like that, I think that we can have a much more solid strategy and plan in order to achieve this goal of the zero trust and a better security posture.
Thank you, Carlos. Now let's hear the conclusion points from Luis.
So following up on Carlos, never forget the layer 8 vulnerabilities. Never forget our users. There is no security strategy that's user-proof. We have to teach our users how to make them secure. We have to teach them how to handle data, how to handle access, how to handle credentials, and understand that it's easy to say that every user is a vulnerability. I don't like this phrase. For me, every user is a sensor. If you teach your users, if you open a communication channel with them, every user can be a sensor, so you can fast detect things that are weird. So have your users trained, have them aware, and don't be punitive when they come with problems, because then they will always raise their hands when they are feeling that something's going on, and you'll be able to use them to your advantage, not as vulnerabilities. And just as a final thought, Costa Rica, suerte mañana con España. Ojalá hagan como hicieron con Argentina hoy.
Okay, thank you. So Sherry, Doel, Carlos, and Luis, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge. I'm sure we have learned so much from you guys. Sherry, you are too humble. You are super smart. Thank you so much for being here with us today. To the audience, thank you for being here, and don't forget about next session about threat landscape 2022 and 2023, what we should expect and how we can prepare for it. So until next time.
Thank you.